Okay, we can talk about everything. Everything smaller than a blue whale. That's a lot of stuff. I'll try to cover it all in the next 40 minutes. Yes, so this is the this is the name of our project. At the bottom are the organizations that are key members of this work, and this picture rather is taken by Chad, who is couldn't be with us here today. But I love this picture to represent this work because primarily what we wanted to do with this project that's just now wrapping up is understand the flow of microplastics in our local environment from land to sea. And this actually shows one of our sampling sites, actually several of them. The Santa Cruz area, you have the San Lorenzo River, the beach in front of the boardwalk, and the ocean right offshore there. And that's one of our sampling sites, well, that system. So we wanted to understand this process in our local waters. So, okay. I don't know how many, we're going to start like really big, bigger than a blue whale. Sorry to let you know this, but we're going to start like planetary big, right? So I study planetary change and how humans impact the ocean, right? How human behavior impacts oceans and ocean life. But at a planetary scale, we have been impacting the Earth for, well, arguably millennia, but severely for the last 150 to 200 years. And so about 20 years ago, a group of researchers got together at the Stockholm Resilience Center and wanted to sort of take out all the information that we had to figure out for each one of these pieces of the pie, this is kind of the major ways in which human activity affects planet Earth. How far have we transgressed the boundaries of what we think the planet could potentially handle for the long term? And so this inner green circle indicates what is the stable operating state of the planet before humans kind of came in and did what humans do. And as these red sort of slices of pizza to get you all ready for lunch go out further and further from this green safe operating space of the planet, that is where more and more of these boundaries, whether it's ocean acidification, climate change, or pollution, as we'll talk about, have been transgressed, or we're concerned about the levels in which the planet has been disrupted by human activity. And so when they first did this assessment in the mid-2000s, what you'll notice is actually a bunch of these wedges are empty, so we couldn't even fully quantify how we were impacting planetary health at that time. But interestingly, and one of them, by the way, was pollution. We didn't actually have the data or enough data to say what we were doing at a planetary scale for pollutants. But in any case, things like biodiversity loss, we'd already blown way past what we think would be the safe operating space for the planet. So an update about 20 years later, 15, 20 years later, now all of those planetary boundaries have been assessed by this same group. And what you'll notice is 6 of 9 of them have been transgressed, what we think is the safe operating space for our planet. But what I really want to point you to is we've renamed chemical pollution to novel entities, but that's the same thing here. But we're really concerned about climate change, right? That's the thing, that's the problem du jour, and it is a problem. But what you'll notice is that the red sector of that diagram is actually far more transgressed for chemical pollution than it is for climate change. So this is not to say that pollution and chemical pollution, which we'll talk about for the rest of this talk, are things that are more concerning per se than climate change, but it's not a competition. We need to think about all these things in concert, and that's what I wanted to bring this to your attention. And it's a cool framework worth looking into if you're not familiar with it. So to give you all just like a really quick background on what we know about plastic pollution, there are 2 ways in which scientists generally report plastic pollution. That is either by mass, how much it weighs, or what its concentration is, the number of particles or pieces per unit volume of air or water or soil, something like that. But in any case, in this sort of landmark study that came out 5 years ago now, we have produced more plastic than there is living wild animal mass on Earth. And that's not actually unusual compared to like the total of what we're doing on Earth. In terms of the total of what we're doing on Earth, all of our anthropogenic created mass, that is concrete, that is plastic, that is all of this industrial material we have created, outweighs all of life on Earth, including humanity, including domestic animals as well. But just for plastic, there is twice as much plastic by weight that has been produced on Earth than there is of living wild animals. When we think about plastic, though, it's individual items. It comes in pieces, right? And so on the bottom here, you see the size range of these pieces arranged from the really small particles, the nanoplastics, all the way up to macroplastics. And beyond macroplastics, we have stuff called megaplastics. That's like giant fishing nets, huge debris. But in any case, these are the types of plastic that we'll talk about, focusing primarily on microplastics. But to look at this general relationship, you have it, and this is generally true in the work that I'll show you, but also in pretty much all scientific work that we're seeing from around the world, which is that if we are reporting the total weight of plastics, in an environment or in a sample that you might collect, the total weight is dominated by larger items, so macroplastics, megaplastics, things like that. If, however, you're interested in the concentration of particles per unit area or per unit volume, the concentration is dominated by very, very small particles. And you'll see this relationship, again, more than once in my talk. But generally speaking, the smaller stuff we look for, the more of it we find. And that relationship is not linear, it's exponential. And I'll talk about that in a little bit using our data. And, so that's the weight of plastic, but a recent report showing, hundreds of trillions of pieces of plastic in the ocean. The point is most of those pieces are really, really small stuff. And actually, depending on how you're looking at the data, this is probably an underestimate. In any case, there's a lot of plastic out there, right? And they probably don't have to convince this audience of that. But when we are talking about plastic, we need to have our definitions down for both communicating to each other, but also for writing legislation to try to mitigate this issue. So in the most general definition, to talk to each other, or when you all go and tell your friends about this talk that you saw today, that obviously will be wonderful. Microplastics are plastic particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters, but greater than 1 micrometer or micron in size. That's the simple definition. The regulatory definition by the state of California is that, and it's a lot of words, but the point is that to know your audience and to know sort of where you're trying to direct, whether it's your science or your advocacy or your communication, is really, really important. And I think it's also exciting that California was the first state to develop a regulatory definition of microplastics, which is the first step in actually mitigating this pollutant. So that's really exciting. Be proud that you're in California. I know that I am. And so we're going to, again, focus primarily on microplastics today. And there are two different types of microplastics, where they originate from. There's primary microplastics, which, do you guys remember when there was plastic in our toothpaste, like little bits, plastic in our face wash? Do you remember that? That was like a thing. Yeah, so that, but also nurdles. Nurdles are the raw material that makes all the plastic items in our life. So they're about 3 to 5 millimeter spherical beads that are produced by petrochemical companies and then shipped to, for example, Pepsi or Dell Computers or whatever company you think of. They melt those products down and turn them into the products that we create. So those are plastics that are microplastics that are created to be microplastics, basically. But the stuff that we now think primarily more so as microplastics are things that have degraded from larger items, right? So all the big plastic items that we buy, then they degrade over time by size. They don't biodegrade. This is one of the problems, or they don't biodegrade in a relevant time scale for us. But those are things, coming from things like food packaging, tire wear particles, fishing gear, and so on. The important point here that I want you to take away, though, is that pretty much all of the microplastic we find in environmental samples are secondary microplastics, almost all of it now. So, and part of this, by the way, I think is regulatory success. So we've banned microbeads, for example, right? We don't have those in our toothpaste or face wash anymore. But the other reason is because we produce a lot of large items out of plastic, and some of those get into the environment, and then they shed little bits of plastic all over the place. But in any case, most of the plastic we find in environmental samples comes from these bigger items. So the plastic pollution story is definitely a North Pacific story, and it's a California story. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to share this with you. I heard someone make a utterance here. Was that who knows who this guy is? You know who this? Raise your hand if you know who this person is. So there's a couple. Yeah, this guy is a real character. He's great. I like him, but he's definitely he's a unique personality. But one I think that the marine community should be proud to call our own. He is captain, obviously, and he is the person that is credited with popularizing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So in the mid 1990s, he has a sailboat that he was, originally it was a sailboat just for sort of for fun. And then when he was crossing the North Pacific, and I think it was 1997 or 96, somewhere around there, he came across a ton of plastic, loads of pieces, in this really remote area of the North Pacific that had not really been reported on very much. So he sort of brought this to the people's attention, and working with folks at SCORP, which is an acronym for the Southern California Coastal Water Research Program, but anyway, a research unit in Orange County, California, and they do a lot of work on pollution in coastal and also nearshore waters. And the director of that institute, Steve Weisberg, who's the last author on this paper, said, if you want to actually make a change on this issue, you should publish something on it, right? Because you could make a lot of noise in the popular press, but eventually that'll sort of wash away, whereas science is forever, for better or worse. And so he worked with folks from his institute, or it wasn't even an institute at the time, it was Charlie, not his wife, someone with the same last name, that he worked with, and these folks at SCORP, to basically describe microplastics in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There is a lot of macroplastics in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch too, but at the time he was actually talking about, in this paper, comparing these tiny bits of plastic to the plankton in that same region of ocean. That's what the SCORP folks wanted him to do, suggested that he do. And what they found was this, at least verbally sound, shocking result, that there was about 6 times more microplastic by weight than plankton in that part of the ocean. That is true, but it's oceanographically a nuanced thing. It's an oligotrophic gyre. We could talk more about that. I won't waste your time with that because we got to move on. But this is to say that he has parlayed all this work and effort and energy into creating his own NGO in Long Beach, California, and they now pioneer the methods to detect and quantify microplastics in the environment, and they are the folks that we work with to detect and quantify microplastics in our samples that we collect from Monterey Bay. This is me with Wynn Cowger, who at the time was their research director. He's now their executive director. Really good guy. If you want to hear more about microplastics, we should definitely get him here to speak on them. Especially the methods. He's great with the method development. In any case, again, specifically looking at microplastics, I want to highlight the fact that the North Pacific, particularly the eastern North Pacific, where we are, is a hotspot for microplastics as well as megaplastics. But in any case, we're talking, at least for now, about the Pacific Garbage Patch. This is roughly where it is. This is approximately its size and its concentration of plastic items per unit area. But the thing that I want to highlight for you is that measurements over time have shown that plastic in this region is growing and growing exponentially. This, again, is perhaps an unfortunate thing, but it's totally predicted by the fact that we're producing more and more plastic. Right? There's just no way around the fact that this trend is going to continue to go like this until we can curtail the amount of plastic we produce. Just that simple. But locally, so we're several hundred miles from the outer edge of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but of course, most environments on Earth now have plastic pollution in them, and the Monterey Bay in Central California is no exception to that. When I first came here in 2017, the National Marine Sanctuary, they had been collecting samples of ocean surface water using a manta trawl net, which is this net here. It has those manta-like wings and a mouth that samples the top portion of the ocean. And they had these samples that they'd collected, and they wanted someone to process those water samples for microplastic to figure out how polluted our surface waters or the surface waters of the sanctuary are with microplastics. So they asked me, can you do that? And I said no. But I said, I have a student who can do that. And so working with a CSUMB student, Lauren Kashuabara, in the dark blue hat, and Sherelle Kahane Rapport, who is now a professor at ODU but was a grad student at the time, we worked to collect more samples and process the samples that were pre-existing collected by the sanctuary. Did a bunch of lab work, and generally speaking, what I want to bring your attention to is this plot from that work. And this shows that on average at these 4 sampling sites, there was a concentration of 1 particle per cubic meter of water. A cubic meter of water is 1,000 liters, okay? And that's the first thing. The second thing I want to highlight, though, is that the standard mesh size of this net, which is to say that the size of plastic that is captured by this net, the smallest size, is about 300 microns, or 0.3 millimeters, which is a little smaller than the period at the end of a sentence on a book, something like that. In microplastic land, that's actually pretty big, and so we'll see that. But the point is, the concentration of plastic in our waters was 1 particle per 1,000 liters for that size class of plastic. On the whale side, because this is Whale Fest after all, this is what got me interested in the problem locally and how we might start to think about the risk that megafauna face here from this problem, if at all. This is an idea suggesting, it wasn't a paper with data, it was in a paper, just an idea that said, hey, these animals that are filtering huge quantities of ocean water and eating tons and tons of prey a day might be at particular risk for ingesting plastic in the ocean. And so we wanted to test that with my boss at Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station, Jeremy Goldbogen, who was collecting a lot of this high-resolution whale feeding data. This is the only bit of whale TV I will show, but this is a humpback whale in Monterey Bay. You'll see loads more of this when Jack talks after lunch. But generally speaking, we got a lot of this stuff, and Jack is going to just show you the best of the best after lunch. So if you like whale TV, come on back for that. That's the only bit of whale TV I'm going to show. Yes, and so, it's not, that's okay. It's not showing up. But the point is that this is where we did this study. Each one of these triangles is where we had samples of microplastic load in the ocean water. And what's not showing up are the points where we actually tagged whales in this region. And so what we did in this study was just simply overlay the plastic concentration in ocean water, look at the literature to see the plastic concentration in things like krill and anchovy, the whale's prey, and then combine those outputs using the whale tag data to see how much they eat per unit time, whether it's a day or a week, and combining those data sets, see how much plastic these whales might be eating at sea. This is work that was led by Sherelle during COVID. That's where our plastic data came from. And, yes, so one of the really cool things here, you're going to have John Ryan later in the day talk from MBARI, but MBARI published a paper that was very important about 5 or so, or 7 years ago now, that actually had the concentration of microplastic in our bay with depth. And so what's interesting here is that was some of the first data of its kind because they were able to use their deep sea ROVs to collect that data. It's really unique information, especially was at the time. But what we found is combining what our tag showed us where whales forage in the water column and where plastic is most concentrated in the water column, those depths aligned quite well, or quite, they aligned, well, not well for the whales, but, but generally speaking, actually, what we generally concluded from this work is that whales eat, probably millions of microplastics per day, but that almost all of it, this is a log scale, so small differences here are actually very, very big differences. But in any case, almost all of the plastic we think that whales are eating, microplastics, in Monterey Bay come from transfer of microplastics from their prey, things like krill or anchovy, to the whales, not actually through filtered water. So those are kind of the big results from that work. Oh, if you want to take a picture, okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I study the way plastic gets into food webs. And moves through food webs. That's what the thing I'm really interested in, frankly, for this problem. And one of those sort of key questions is, what is the pathway by which plastic gets into food webs and moves through food webs? And remember how we were talking about like primary microplastics before and secondary microplastics? So here you can almost think about it as primary ingestion. If you see a piece of plastic or you don't, and you inadvertently or purposefully eat the plastic directly, which would be plastic from the water, versus secondary ingestion, which is to say that you ate something that previously ate plastic, which is from prey. So that's primarily what's going on there. Yeah, thanks for that question. Great, good one. Yeah, we think so. Mm-hmm. And other studies have since, I don't want to say confirmed that, but further supported that point from other places around the world. So that was some of the early work that led to this proposal that we wrote and was funded in 2023. funded by the Ocean Protection Council and California Sea Grant, to understand how, again, plastic moves from land to ocean, or freshwater to saltwater, and into the food web in Monterey Bay. This is the map of our sampling sites. So we are looking at 4 different river to sea systems, the major rivers in our Central Coast area. So the San Lorenzo River, the Pajaro River, the Salinas River, and the Carmel River. And we're looking at river water, beach sand, and surface seawater in this environment, as well as the food chain that leads to whales. So that is to say krill, anchovy, and whales. Yes, so the main things that we wanted to figure out are, again, how plastic flows through this ecosystem and into the food web. So from land to sea to wildlife. We want to try to do what we can, and this is actually a really hard thing to do, to figure out where the plastic comes from. We could talk later about that, but this is really hard. We put in a new proposal about this exact thing by itself. Didn't get funded, but we persevere. And then this here, which I think was extremely successful, was figuring out that realizing that the folks of our region and worldwide really care about this issue, and so many people were deeply, deeply engaged in it. And many of you are here, so thank you for all your work. You will see some of your photos up here in a minute. And then finally, we wanted to figure out, and I think this would be a really cool goal. It would be fun to work with Mbari on this. But to figure out, basically, to use Monterey Bay as like a model system to understand where plastic is coming from and ending up in a large open ocean system, which has not really been done yet, and I think in a lot of ways would provide a gold standard for the rest of the world for how to model and understand this problem. Okay, so field work, yes. So we sampled rivers. This is a cool system that Pam Crone, who just recently retired from the Sanctuary and the Sanctuary Foundation, devised, which is a battery-operated ISCO pump, pumping hundreds of liters of water through stacked sieves, hanging off a bridge over I think it's the Pajaro River. And so it's a way to sample a lot of water, but not actually retain all that water, right? Because microplastics are still a trace pollutant. What that means is that they are at low concentration, right, relative to the things in the environment that should be there, which is good. But to actually understand how much is there, we need to collect an enormous volume, and we don't want to be lugging around hundreds of liters of water, so we filter it through using those pumps. This is doing that same process offshore Santa Cruz. This is doing a similar type process using with beach sand on one of our local beaches. Does anyone know what this is here? A hang glider? No. I see what you mean, because it's a blue background. No, it's much smaller than a hang glider, but still an impressive thing. A hair cell? No. Yeah, it's in the water. It's in the water. No, so these are great guesses. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. It's a blow-up of a photo, and this is Jack, who will talk after lunch, about to grab that beautiful piece of blue whale turd. Poop. It's poop, everyone. Yeah, I mean, most of the times it's more fluffy and less discreet than this, but that is the most beautiful whale turd I've ever seen. I didn't see it. I wasn't there, but you texted me, and I was just like, I've never seen it be such like a beautiful. What a beautiful piece that was. Thank you, Jack. And so when we then process these samples, yes, including that poop, what we get are these little plastic bits. This is the larger size class. Again, we're looking at larger microplastics that you can analyze with optical microscopes and sometimes your naked eye, as well as smaller microplastics that you need fancy instrumentation for. We're looking at both of those different size classes of plastic. Yep. And so for that lab work, we've split it in two. We have the larger size class of plastics being analyzed and evaluated at our lab at the Hopkins Marine Station by a bunch of amazing interns and myself from CSUMB. And yeah, they're awesome. This is what some of those plastics look like in the samples, for example. But then this here on the right shows what the sample looks like when we send the smaller size class to the Moore Institute, the previously mentioned Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research, and they process it with an instrument known as a micro FTIR, which is just an instrument that can individually detect little bits on a filter that have been selected from our sample, and then identify what those bits are made of, plastic or otherwise. So to show some of our early results, which I'm excited that folks here that helped collect these results are here to see some of these early results. This top bit of panels are from the larger size class of plastics in our environment. For the larger size class, almost all the particles are white, blue, and black. We can talk about why that is if folks are interested, or why we think that is. If you look at by different types of sample, we see the beaches are a lot more polluted with plastic than any of our ocean or any of our water samples, river or ocean. And also that we find foam, like styrofoam type, expanded polystyrene on our beaches, but basically nowhere else. And besides that, it's almost entirely fiber-like particles, which is pretty common. And a question that we sought to answer and that we've gotten a bunch is sourcing, thinking about, there's a lot of agricultural plastic in our county here. And so, but what's interesting is that in the rivers anyway that we sampled, the rivers that have agricultural watersheds attached to them primarily seem to be less polluted than the rivers that have more urban watersheds attached to them. Don't worry about the details of this, but basically each bar is a sample. So this is the larger size class. This is now the smaller size class. Someone mentioned a human hair, I think earlier. A human hair is about 100 microns thick. So the particles here are approximately the width of a human hair, but we go a little bit smaller than that as well. One thing to notice is that micro FTIR instrument that they use, it identifies all different types of particles in the sample. And so about a third of them are plastic, but there's also a lot of mineral, which is to say like sandy bits, silty bits, and a lot of organic matter. So that's, dead plants and plant matter, bird feathers, things like that. But again, getting back to what actually sort of matters for both potentially regulation, but also risk in the ecosystem, and we can sort of come up with concentrations where the slide was kind of mushed here, but the point is that per liter now, remember I was talking about one particle per 1,000 liters in the data from about 10 years ago that we processed. For ocean water and river water, it's now about one particle per liter, so about 1,000 times more concentrated than it was. And for beach sand, it's 42 times that amount. This is largely, and I'll reiterate this in a minute, but this we think is largely due to the fact that we're looking for smaller particles, actually. So we think, yes, plastic probably has increased over that decade time, but that the primary driver of these huge differences is the fact that we're using better methods to look for smaller particles. And if we look for even smaller particles, those numbers will go up. The micro FTIR also identifies what types of plastics we see in our environment. The micro FTIR identified just over 24 different types of plastics in our samples so far. Our samples are about 70% complete, so this is about 70% of what the final will be. But what I think is the interesting takeaway here is that there's not an even spread, right? Almost all the plastics that we produce and ultimately gets into our waste stream and into the environment are of these plastic types that you've probably heard of, things like polypropylene, polyethylene, polystyrene, and so on. But there can be a whole talk on just this. I won't do that to you. But what I will say is let's just highlight one point here, which is that polypropylene is by far the most common type of microplastic in our environment. What's interesting about that is that if you look at total plastic produced, it's actually less than 20% is polypropylene. But when you get to the waste side of things, it's about double that, at least in our data. So, but going to the global data, this is also generally what we find. So polypropylene seems to be really good at escaping, is what this means. And it's not just from our data, but it's cool to see that our data reflects this broader global pattern. One of the reasons why I think this is because polypropylene is extremely buoyant, so it can just escape any sort of, it can really just bounce over sort of mitigation techniques really easily. Anything in the water column, it'll just probably go over. But in any case, there's a lot of polypropylene out there. Oh, I see. Oh, this is actually convenient because we haven't published this yet. What this shows is a plot of how much rivers transport microplastic from the river to the sea in our ecosystem. What the main result is that we think there's tens or maybe even hundreds of billions of particles per year that are transported by the rivers into our ocean. But because our rivers are intermittent, which is to say that half of the year they do not flow to the ocean, most of what happens, we think, is, and what our data would show if it were here, is that the plastic in sort of the estuaries and those regions of the river, all that stuff builds up over the course of the year, and then during that first like big rainfall event that breaches the natural dam that formed from at the end of the river and pushes that water out to sea, what we call a first flush, that almost all that microplastic transport happens during that first flush. And this is, useful to understand how the system works. Both ecologically, it's interesting, but from mitigation side, it's perhaps useful to think about the fact that the timing is really important here of when these pollutants get pushed out to sea. So that's what this would show, but it doesn't. That's fine, because we're going to move right on to the fact that, yes, there's higher concentrations of plastic over time in this environment, but again, I think that's primarily due to the fact that we're looking for smaller particles rather than an increase in plastics over time, though both are happening. And there's some really amazing tools. Again, this could be its own talk in and of itself. Wynn Cowger and Scott Coffin, folks that we work with, develop these sort of risk assessment tools. And what these tools do is they take data from laboratory experiments, which there are many and they are growing, of how model organisms react to basically being fed different concentrations of plastic and the effects that has, both sublethal and lethal, on those lab animals, and translating those results to environmental samples that we have, right? Because there's that bridge that's really hard to connect, which is to say controlled lab experiments, the real world, how do you bring those pieces together? And that's what these software tools are aiming to do. Really cool stuff. But in general, where we're at with, at least this for the surface seawater, which is the data that all this is from to be consistent, we're at the level where we don't think we should be panicking, but it is worth monitoring, right? And monitoring takes money, and that's the problem, because monitoring isn't very sexy, at least until you find something crazy, and this is just, and on we go. And so, but for beaches, the concentration, or the beach sand, the concentration is much higher. There's a bunch of caveats about this, which is that beach sand is a very, very different matrix, or what we call like type of environment, than water. Animals don't live in sand in the same way they live in water. They do live in sand, but not in the same sort of type of way. Animals aren't really filtering sand, these types of things. So, but in any case, the beaches are quite polluted in our area. Oh, what was I going to show here? Oh yeah, right. So generally what I want to show here is this pattern, which is that for all the concern and the angst that there is about microplastics, or just plastic pollution generally in our world, we have a lot of information to suggest that certain concentrations affect organisms and cellular or organ system type processes. So suborganismal or organismal, there's a lot of good information to suggest that plastics are harmful at certain concentrations. But when we think about how that then might scale up to the scale of ecological communities, ecosystems, and planetary biodiversity, the data is very sparse, and for microplastics, non-existent. Like there is zero data, zero convincing published stuff that I've seen about the effects of microplastics on a wild population of animals. I've not seen one single thing. Lots of lab work, but not anything from a wild population. So back to Jack, and we all know what he's holding now. Dirty stuff. That's what the poop looks like under the microscope. That's what a microplastic in a poop looks like under a microscope. Now you know. It is very similar to what has been published in other parts of the world. Similar filter feeding whales. What we're seeing is a lot of fibers, a lot of small things. And this is a project that we're sort of just diving into in a real way with another wonderful CSUMB student, Owen. And it's a way for Jack and I to work together over our shared love of feces. And Yes. So what are we learning at a bigger scale? We're learning that most of this stuff, I should say pretty much all of it, is reflected in the broader literature from around the world as well, but it's nice to actually also see these results coming out in our work. Which is to say that the smaller particles we look for, the more we find, and that relationship is exponential rather than linear, or more exponential than it is linear. The fact that beaches are probably both a source and a sink for this pollution, which is to say that yes, plastic is deposited there, probably from rivers and atmosphere and ocean water, but also that beachgoers are inadvertently or purposefully leaving trash there. The fact that at a risk scale, we don't actually think there's extreme risk, at least from the levels that we've seen, but perhaps at certain times of year or in certain portions of the environment, those risk levels can be elevated, and it's something that we should continue to monitor for. There's a bunch of different plastics that we found in the environment, but almost all of them are these 5 really common plastic types. Like the foam is really common on beaches, which is interesting because foam is now the main source we think for foam is for food takeaway materials, which is now actually illegal in California. So one of the reasons why it's important to do this monitoring is to see how effective that legislation actually is. So if we can monitor this stuff over time, what would be really interesting to us is to see, okay, well, do we actually see a reduction in this type of pollution over time on our beaches as this legislation takes effect? There's more details to share there if people are interested, but I won't for now. We're doing stuff with the whale poop. So for all you people who want to know more about whale poop, we'll talk more. And it's been really awesome to see how engaged and excited the public is about this work. So, and about this topic, and I take that as a broader interest in environmental conservation and ocean sustainability in this community. So I'm very happy to be a part of that with you all. So thank you all for that. And the thing that I like to think about, and then we're going to end this on a message of hope, which is that California is an awesome place to live. I'm not from California, but I'm happy to be here because someone told me, I forget who it was now, but California is the US 30 years in the future. I don't know how we're going to sort of... I wrote this slide before 2024, okay? But I've been since updating it. In any case, there's a lot of legislation moving through the state legislature that deal with this issue. We are by far the most progressive state on this issue and have been doing stuff to stem or understand to hopefully stem the flow of plastic pollution from our human environment to the natural environment for over a decade now. So it's been really cool to be to just live in a state where that's happening. The current work that's going on, which I encourage you all to follow if you're interested, is SB 54, which is the most powerful extended producer responsibility bill in the country. Definitely for plastic. I don't want to say any type of pollution, but definitely for plastic. What it says is that we should basically improve compostability, like true compostability, improve recycling, and reduce the amount of plastic we're producing. Again, there's some numbers there, but that's the general point. And these slides will be online, so you could look at these at length if you'd like. As I mentioned, there's a foam ban now for foam foodware that's statewide. It just went into effect last year, so it'll be interesting to see over time if and how this changes what we see in our environment. And now there is actually a fine of $50,000 per day violation for entities that are giving out foam packaging. So if you want to be a narc, that's how you can do it. There is the link to learn more. But there are challenges to this law, like right now currently. So the industry is pushing back at various parts of this law, basically trying to narrow the language of what we're calling plastic, expand the language of what we're calling compostable and stuff like that. So, again, if this is an issue you're excited about, there's a lot going on right now with SB 54 to dig into. But in 2027, arguably, I think the most exciting aspect of this law takes effect, which is that producers are required to contribute to a $500 million annual mitigation fund, supposedly primarily directed toward disadvantaged, that's the word, communities, which is great, and by far the most proactive bill toward that in the country right now. And even in this climate, the political climate nationally that we're in right now, this is an area where we actually agree. And so I think that's important to find areas that we still have some common ground left. And I think that's really exciting. And microplastic pollution is perhaps one of them. So it was just announced that the EPA, the current EPA, is going to consider microplastic as a priority pollutant, which is to say that if it actually passes as a priority pollutant, then, for example, drinking water needs to be screened for microplastics moving forward. And they also put forth $150 million to understand human health impacts of plastics. And we should all care about this, again, probably preaching to the choir for this audience, but we should care about, the human health of this because, or sorry, rather the environmental health of this, because it's all the same thing, right? We should care about the environmental health and pollution in our environment because we live in the environment, right? And so our health is connected to the health of this environment, and obviously animal health as well. These things are one topic called the One Health approach, sort of pioneered by the World Health Organization. But in any case, all of these things are connected. So if you're interested in human health, you're also interested in environmental health, and so on. That's what I want to sort of end with. Lots of people to thank. I'll do it with pictures. This is more commonly what whale poop looks like when we encounter it. Is that also you? Okay. So yeah, so Jack's gonna get more whale poop going for you guys after lunch. But for now, I'll leave you with that and say thank you for having me, and let me know if you have any questions.